Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on the Plastics Paradox Part 2, Solutions. Last night we talked about some of the issues that come with our reliance on plastic. Tonight we address the possible solutions and start with an expert on how we got here and why we started using so much plastic. Joining us now live via Zoom is Dr. Anthony Andrade, adjunct professor of chemical and biomolecular engineering at North Carolina State University. Dr. Andrade, thank you for joining us this evening and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the discussion with the creation of plastic. How did it work and what was the original application?
The plastics, the very first plastic was actually made around late 1800s. The ceremonial introduction of plastics to the consumer world actually goes back to the 1939 New York City World's Fair, when nylon was first introduced, and it was a craze at that time because the women's stockings, leggings were made of silk at that time, and nylon was introduced as a substitute. And you can see how popular and how successful the product was. It sold 45 million pairs in just the first year that it was introduced. Since then, we have not looked back. We have made almost anything we can think of with plastics. And right now, we manufacture 359 million tons worldwide of resin every year. It's, of course, going to continue to increase from that number. So we are addicted to plastics in a sense, but because it's a very useful material, and our lives are much easier because of plastics.
Yeah, that's a great way to put things in perspective on how much we rely on plastic. Now, many items wouldn't exist otherwise without plastic, such as car parts, small appliances, and electronic parts. Could any of these items be replaced with something other than plastic?
Actually, some of them could be. Like most of our plastics are used in packaging. And packaging certainly can be made of glass, of metal, or even paper. But the problem is most other materials are either too dense. That means if you make a package out of glass, it's much heavier than the same package containing the same amount of food made of plastic. And if you make it out of metal, that would be the same. So when you have a heavier material, heavier package, then it takes more energy to move it around the country to distribute it. And it, of course, creates more pollution every time you burn gasoline to move goods around the country. So there are other materials you could use, but from an environmental perspective, those materials are too expensive compared to plastics. And also, when you look at the market cost, it is also too expensive to use something like glass, which can break, or something like metal, which is expensive. So plastics will keep on continue on to be more and more popular because of that.
Now, Dr. Andrade, you've researched how degradability of plastic works. Will plastic in a landfill break down faster than in the ocean?
In a landfill, plastics hardly break down. In the ocean, on the other hand, as long as the plastics float on the surface of seawater, where it receives some amount of sunlight, then it can undergo some level of degradation. However, first of all plastics do not float on water. For example, nylon does not, it sinks in water. And even the plastics that float in water, like polyethylene, after some time in the ocean, they get fouled and get denser and then sink below the water column into the sediment. So the time window available for it to degrade, even in the ocean, is very, very short. So I would say that they are both about the same. Both, of course, preserve the plastic without degrading it for a very long time. And we do not know exactly how long a given type of plastics might last, either in the landfill or in the ocean.
Now, what is, in your mind, the most important concern about the creation, use, and disposal of plastic, and how close are we to solving that problem?
The biggest problem with plastics is not its performance. It's a great material, We can do with plastics things that we cannot do with any other material today. So it's a good invention and it's a good material to have. The problem is that when we use so much plastics, and it's going to be even bigger in the future, we are going to make more and more plastics. Some say about 1,000 metric tons by 2050. And if you make plastics in that large scale, we must also have a good solution for waste management, because post-consumer waste plastic is now being landfill for the most part. In the US, we recycle only about 30% of the material. So when you have waste materials improperly disposed of as litter or is simply landfill, then there is a chance that some of that plastic, and recent estimates place 8 to 12 million tons a year of that plastic, would reach the ocean. And once it reaches the ocean, it breaks up into tiny pieces called the microplastics. And these microplastics do a lot of damage to the marine organisms. And that is the crux of the problem. And I think that's the problem we need to really focus on. And we are not anywhere near solving that problem, because that solution would involve a lot of different parties. It should involve the chemical industry that produces plastics, who should remember that we need to have the plastics degrade under certain conditions. It takes some commitment of the consumer, who would understand the implications of irresponsible disposal of plastics, either as litter or otherwise. And finally, it also takes the commitment of scientists and sociologists who would look for long-term solutions to the problem and see if the material can be made better, or are there behavioral strategies that would prevent the waste plastics reaching the ocean that we have not yet explored. I think we are just scratching the surface.
A lot to think of right there. I'm sorry, Dr. Andrade, we are out of time, but we appreciate your time so much. You've been hearing from Dr. Anthony Andrade, adjunct professor at North Carolina State University. Doc, thank you for making time to join us tonight. It was a pleasure to have you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on the plastics paradox. When you think about issues surrounding plastic, the companies that manufacture, and the use that the material needs to be part of the conversation. Joining us now is Matt Seaholm, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Plastics Industry Association. Matt, thanks for joining us tonight and welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Rosie. Appreciate it.
Matt, I'd like to begin this discussion with learning more about your role in representing the plastics industry in government affairs. What kind of work do you do?
Well, sure. So we represent the entire plastic supply chain. So at present, there are over 1,200 bills and regulations across the states that we're tracking, as well as dozens at the federal level as well. So our job is to work with stakeholders, coalitions, and obviously policymakers to, talk about the important issues facing our country as it relates to the plastics industry, and do our best to represent the more than 1 million employees in the American plastics industry.
Well, needless to say, you've got your plate full. Now, what is the industry's view on recycling plastics? Are they buying and repurposing plastics to keep them out of the ocean and landfills?
Oh, absolutely. Well, let me first start by saying, hey, we certainly agree that we don't want to see any of our products end up in a place where they don't belong. Whether that's a waterway, side of the road, it doesn't matter. We don't want to see that just like anybody else. As far as going back to the question about what do we view about recycling, we love it. We do it. We have members that recycle. We have members that use recycled content. And much of our discussions are surrounding the issue of recycling and how do we recycle more. We know we need to collect more. We know we need to recycle more. And much of the conversations happening at both the state and federal level are about how do we do that.
Now, a lot of recycled plastics were shipped to China for repurposing. China recently stopped importing these plastics. How has the industry and government responded since then?
Yeah, there's no doubt that when China implemented their policy a few years back, it caught us flat-footed. There had been for far too long a market overseas for the recyclable material that we should have been building the necessary infrastructure here in the United States to deal with, and we weren't. And now we're playing a little bit of catch up. This is really a failure on a lot of fronts, and we certainly understand that. All the way down to, from the collection point to when it gets recycled, and most importantly, the sorting process. So when they implemented that policy, really a lot of folks started scrambling here, and that's what we're currently faced with. But there are a lot of opportunities as well, and some of it starts with building the infrastructure, but a lot of it comes down to the innovation that is now happening at a breakneck pace, including things like advanced recycling.
Now, Matt, some countries require plastics manufacturers to assume more direct responsibility for proper plastic disposal. Should that happen here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think the concept you're talking about is extended producer responsibility, and these are some of the legislation I was talking about earlier is currently being discussed at a state level, and there's likely a bill going to be introduced as soon as Thursday in Congress to talk about this issue. And I have to say, as an industry, we look at recycling and we understand that the great need for recycling infrastructure investment. And we know there needs to be a funding mechanism to do that. As an industry, we understand that we have a role to play in this process, as well as an important role to lead in trying to get things done. And that's what we're trying to do. So as you can imagine, with any major policy decision, the devil's in the details, and that's part of the sausage making process at the legislative level. But I really do believe that if we work together, we're going to find solutions that work, and they're going to provide some meaningful results.
Now, Matt, we've got about a minute left in our discussion. We've talked about a few solutions already. What else is the industry doing to help curb the environmental impacts of plastics? And what changes do we as individuals need to do in order to help solve some of these problems?
Well, I think, Dr. Andrade actually hit on some really important points of the benefits of plastic. I mean, every time one of our members is helping their customers to use less material, to use less energy, to use more recycled content, and in creating things like new products that reduce food spoilage, all of that is a net benefit. It's an improvement on what we were previously using as it relates to the environment. But there's a lot of other things that we need to do. You can also look at things like automotive applications. The amount of energy that is saved by using lighter materials in cars is incredible. As an individual, we all need to use less. We certainly preach the idea of sustainable use. We don't ever want to see one of our products used in an unsustainable fashion. So if you can use a reusable cup rather than a single-use cup, that's certainly something we talk about on a regular basis. But shop with sustainability in mind. If you don't need 2 packages, use 1. There are a lot of things that we can all do, and if we do it, you're going to see some significant successes.
Yeah, change is hard, but there's just little things that we can do every single day to work towards a bigger good. All right, you've been hearing from Matt Seaholm, Vice President of Governmental Affairs with the Plastics Industry Association. Matt, thanks for joining our discussion tonight. We enjoyed having you.
You bet. Thanks, Rosie.
Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on the plastics paradox. We turn now to looking ahead to more biodegradable materials, which would significantly alleviate our dependence on plastics. Joining us now live via Zoom is Dr. Ramani Narayan, a distinguished professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Materials Science. Dr. Narayan, thanks for making time for us tonight, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rosie. It's good to be here.
Dr. Narayan, what in your mind is the biggest issue with plastic?
Very simply, there are 2 issues. What I call end of life, which is what happens to the plastic after use when it enters the waste stream, and what I also call the beginning of life. Should we be using plant biomass renewable carbon in place of fossil carbon? But therein lies the paradox. You heard from Dr. Andrade that plastics saves lives, helmets saves lives, lightweighting automotive saves fuel emissions, Plastics in agriculture improves productivity. Insulations keeps us warm and save energy, and so on and so forth. That is the paradox which is facing all of us.
Now, you've conducted a lot of research in new materials that are more environmentally friendly than plastic. What are some of those items and how are they made?
Our research focus, and many colleagues of mine, focus on what we call innovate materials, new plastics that maintain the value attributes of today's plastics, but is redesigned, where we change the backbone molecular structure so that it will break down and be completely utilized by microorganisms present in that disposal environment. They use it as food, carbon food. And that is done in a managed, closed loop, environmentally responsible disposal system like composting, which many of your audience may be familiar with.
So what products can most easily be replaced by these more biodegradable materials?
To answer that question, let's focus on what the municipal solid waste stream is composed of. And 50% of that is biodegradable organic waste, food, paper, green waste. And today, think about it, we send it to a landfill, what I call preserving garbage for posterity, or in open dumps, where it breaks down to methane, which almost everybody realizes is a 25x contributor to the greenhouse gases. So plastics, today's plastic, which are inherently not biodegradable, but associated with food packaging, with paper, with these biodegradable streams, can be made biodegradable and integrated with an end of life like composting to close the loop in what we now term the circular economy. And to add to that, remember that 40% of the 358 million metric tons of plastics being manufactured today is used in packaging, which is a very big number if you can imagine that.
Now, Dr. Narayan, we have about 90 seconds left. What can you tell us about the recycling of plastics? Anything innovative or impactful happening in that field?
So the recycling can be broadly now put as chemical recycling, biological organic recycling, which is the composting I talked to you about, and mechanical recycling. Originally, the focus has always been on the mechanical recycling part of it. But now the industry has really geared up with a lot of support and effort to ensure that we don't allow plastics to leak into the environment, but be recovered and collected and then sent to appropriate systems, whether it is organic or chemical or biological recycling.
Now, Doc, we have about 30 seconds left. As the person with the last word in tonight's discussions, anything else you'd like our viewers to think about when it comes to plastics?
I would reiterate that old saying, don't throw the baby with the bathwater out. Plastics has problems towards its end of life, but it is a very useful, unique material that contributes tremendously to life as we know it today. But by engaging it, even from a customer perspective or a user perspective, to make sure that plastics don't leak into the environment, to be helping in the recovery and recycling, to help promote the new compostable plastic so that it can go into composting infrastructures in what I call be informed, be knowledgeable, ask questions, and do your part.
Well said, given us a lot to think about tonight. All right, you've been hearing from Dr. Ramani Narayan, Distinguished Professor at Michigan State University. Dr. Narayan, we really appreciate your insight and thoughts tonight. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Now, an important thing to note, some of the images you saw during the discussions tonight were all taken by Bree Van Houten, a photographer living in southern Utah. Her work will be featured at the symposium this week. And if you are interested in attending the event, which is presented by the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and Environment, head over to law.utah/research/Stegner.